Hey guys, it's Coliwood Studios here with a very interesting type of video. So, as many of you know, if you've ridden a roller coaster, there's a very different experience whether you ride in the front row of that roller coaster or the back row. And today I'm going to be focusing in on Great Adventures roller coasters, which is in Jackson, New Jersey, and taking a look at whether the front row or back row is better on these coasters. In addition to giving my own opinion, I actually did an audience poll on Instagram a couple weeks ago to find out what people liked better on coasters, whether it was the front row or back row. So I will tell you what people thought was better, front row or back row, and the percentage that it won by. So for example, say that Dark Knight won back row, and it won by 51%, meaning that it was given 51% of the vote. That's how I would word it. But let's get started with Dark Knight, and I actually do prefer the front row on Dark Knight. It doesn't really make too much of a difference since there's only two rows anyways, the front row and the back row, but it's definitely a little smoother, a better view of course, and overall a bit of a better experience in the front row. Audience score for Dark Knight, front row, 81% of the vote. Next up we have Skull Mountain, and I know pretty much everyone agrees that back row is the way to go on Skull Mountain. The main reason for this is the fact that its drop in the back row is actually really fun for a family coaster. You get some really nice floater airtime going down that drop, and it's really fun. Skull Mountain audience score, back row, 78% of the vote. Next up we have Runaway Mine Train, and this can really go either way. I personally do prefer the back row. It's just a little more comfortable, as I'm sure many of you know that final ejector hill is crazy jarring in the front row, and I know some people really like that, but in order to ride it like multiple times, riding front row every time just destroys you. It's pretty brutal, that transition in the front row. It's really fun though. You still get some great airtime in the back row, which for a mine train is absolutely insane. Mine Train audience rating, back row, 52% of the vote. Next up we have Joker, and Joker is very difficult because there's not really a front row or back row. It's more so facing forwards or facing backwards. And the way I look at it is that when I'm on Joker, I would rather be facing backwards at the top of the lift hill. So what that means is that I'd rather be facing the Nitro and Jersey Devil side of the park, as opposed to when you're forwards facing the Bizarro side of the park. So personally, I do prefer going backwards just because I find it a little more comfortable when you're going down that drop and all the flips. Joker's restraints are very weird because they have some kind of covering towards your lower body area, and if you're not stapled, which I recommend everyone staple themselves on Joker, you're definitely going to go flying into that, but in general I do tend to find myself enjoying bowing backwards more. Joker audience score, backwards, 60% of the vote. Next up we have Superman, and Superman to me, it's a ride that I really don't ride that much as it is. I just don't find too much enjoyment out of it, but when I do go on it, I tend to just try to get on the back row. Main reason for that is the best element on the ride, which is obviously the pretzel loop, is way better in the back row if you ask me. The pull you get going down into the pretzel loop is absolutely insane in the back row, and it's very intense. Unfortunately, the rest of the ride, it doesn't really make a difference where you sit, it just turns and then the inline twist. But I would definitely take the back row for the pretzel loop. Superman audience score, front row, 54% of the vote. Next we have Green Lantern, and this is a ride where it's kind of tough because front row and back row are definitely the two best rows on that ride. I find them to be the most smooth, the most enjoyable, and it can really go either way. Personally, I would take front row just because it is a little smoother than the back row, and of course you get that great view. But back row is still really good and really intense. Green Lantern audience score, front row, 71%. Batman the Ride. Now this is a ride that is very difficult because it's two very different experiences in the front row and back row. Front row, you get different forces at different points, and the same can be said about the back row. For example, in the front row, when you're going into that loop, I almost gray out every time when I'm going into that first vertical loop. It's just so intense. Whereas in the back row, you get more force when you're coming out of that loop because you're increasing in speed. So you get two very different feelings of force. Personally, I would take the back row, and the main reason for that is that last corkscrew, if you're sitting on the right side, you get some crazy whip going through it, and it's just really enjoyable. But you can really go either way, front or back row on Batman. Batman audience score, back row, 58% of the vote. Next up we have Bizarro, and this is a ride where really I don't care if I sit front or back row because both are very good. I tend to go for the back row since that never has a line compared to the front row, but either way, it's a very good ride. I do prefer the back row slightly just because I feel like you get some more whip going through the inversions, but there really isn't much of a difference whether you sit in the front row or back row. I think the biggest difference is when you're in the front row, you get a better view and a better feeling of the fire when it's on the dive loop than the back row, but otherwise there really isn't too much of a difference. Bizarro audience rating, front row, 56% of the vote. Next up we have KingDakar, and I mean, I think everyone would agree that front row is way better than back row. Front row always has a crazy long line, and that's because you're going 128 miles per hour and up 456 feet. You're going to want to feel that launch in the front row because you're going to get all the wind just rushing into your face. Front row is also by far the smoothest row on KingDakar. What's interesting about KingDakar is that each car is made up of 2 rows, and they're both wheel seats technically, except for the front car, which actually has a 0 car in front of the front row, meaning that the front row is not riding over wheels, which actually makes it way smoother than any other row. Back row is still really good as you get some good force and whatnot. Every row on KingDakar is great, but absolutely nothing beats the feeling you get in the front row of KingDakar. KingDakar audience score, front row, 90% of the vote. Next up we have Nitro, and for me, I would definitely have to take the back row on Nitro. You get some really good airtime on the drop and airtime hills, and the final finale with all the little bunny hops, in my opinion, is just a hair better in the back row. Of course, the drop off the mid-course is better in the back row, and overall, I just prefer Nitro slightly more in the back row, just because I find you get some more better airtime than you do in the front row. Nitro audience score, back row, 70% of the vote. Next we have Jersey Devil, and I kind of flip-flop this a lot, so I'm going to give my whole thought process for Jersey Devil and why I like a certain row better than the other. So, as I'm sure you all know if you've ridden Jersey Devil is a totally different ride from the morning to the night. It needs a little bit of time to warm up, and in the morning it definitely runs a lot slower than it does at night, or even later in the day, so in the morning I definitely take the back row. Since Jersey Devil isn't really running fast enough to make all the elements go as good as they do later in the day, you get the feeling in the back row on that drop still, regardless of how fast it's running. And let me just say, the drop on Jersey Devil in the back row is one of the best drops ever. But later in the day, when Jersey Devil has had time to warm up, I definitely would take the front row by just a little bit. And here's a couple reasons. So let's break it down element by element. Back row is definitely better for the drop, but when you're going through that dive loop, it's actually a lot better in the front row because you get some really good whip and airtime going through that element. It's really insane. From there you have the airtime hill, which is good in any row. It gives you some great ejector airtime. But going into the stall, I actually do prefer the front row for this element, as I feel like you float through the entire stall and then you just hang there, whereas the back row kind of pulls you through. That doesn't mean the element's bad in the back row, I just personally prefer it slightly in the front row. Then you go up into the turnaround, and the entrance into the turnaround is better in the front as you get some really good whip and airtime, and the drop off the turnaround is obviously better in the back row since you get airtime out of it. So that element's pretty much mixed. 0G roll is great in any row, it gives some really good floater airtime, and then we get to the second half of the ride. So the second half of the ride has definitely been criticized slightly, but I actually really like this half of the ride, and the main reason for that is the front row, and you actually get some really good floater airtime over these hills. It's actually really cool. But back row is still good, but you get more airtime in the front row in the second half. So for me, I like front row better on Jersey Devil a hair once it warmed up, but in the morning I definitely take back row. Jersey Devil audience score, back row, 85% of the vote. Finally, we have El Toro, and I mean, for me, there is no beating a back row ride on El Toro. The airtime you get on the drop and the camelbacks and the rolling thunder hill is just absolutely incredible. You go flying out of your seat, and the strength of the airtime is absolutely insane. Front row still gives some really powerful airtime on the 2 camelbacks and the rolling thunder hill, but nothing beats El Toro's drop in my opinion, and the drop is best, of course, in the back row. So I will have to take El Toro in the back row. El Toro audience score, back row, 88%. So we've gone through every major coaster great adventure. I left out Lil Devil and Harley Quinn since it really doesn't make much of a difference on those rides, but that's every pretty major ride at Great Adventure, whether you like it better in the front row or back row. Definitely let me know what you agree or disagree on in the comment sections based off of my opinions or the audience scores. Also, let me know if you'd like to see more of these types of videos. I'm definitely interested in doing it for more parks, as it's always interesting to see what people prefer on rides. Of course, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys next time.